Welcome to the Earth+Flax studio. Natalie here with an exciting side table project. These are white oak side tables built by a talented craftsman in the Finger Lakes region. And I did the finishing, and today I'm going to walk you through the steps and product combination I used to achieve these finishes on our unfinished side table over here. You might be able to tell, but I used primarily the Viking Natural Linseed Oil Wax on most surfaces. It really brings out the beautiful wood grain of the white oak. And for the drawer front, I actually used the Ottosson Burnt Umber Linseed Oil Paint to add some pigmentation and create some fun contrast. Once that was dry, I did top coat it with the natural wax to create consistency of finish across the whole piece. And once that was dry, I added our little leather hardware piece. One factor I wanted to touch on briefly is that furniture applications require a level of finesse that you don't really need for a flooring project or restoring the exterior of your house, for example. So take the time to experiment with some of the various materials on various wood substrates before you jump into a more important furniture project. And I think this is true for homeowners, DIYers, professional furniture makers. Get a sense of the interaction of the different paints and stains and oils and waxes before you sort of jump into something that you really care about. We want to make sure that you have sort of confidence in how these different materials interact together so you can achieve sort of the best results and the results that you're looking for. So for example, we did a decent amount of tests on some white oak samples before we did this project. This was the natural Viking Linseed Oil Wax that we ended up using quite a bit. This was a test with the burnt umber. We tried it as a sort of wiping it in as a paint, as well as mixing with oil to create more transparency for a burnt umber linseed oil stain. This was the iron oxide black paint to create really intense opacity. And then we top coated with the natural wax. And this was the iron oxide black paint with more oil, creating a linseed oil stain for more transparency. So you can see a lot is possible. It's just sort of that comfort level that might take a little bit of experimentation before you land on exactly what you are looking for and what you want to use for your furniture projects. To prepare for applying the natural Viking Linseed Oil Wax, we've sanded to a 220 grit and then just wiped and vacuumed several times. It's important to try to achieve as dust-free an environment as possible before we apply our finish. The Viking Natural Linseed Oil Wax is a very versatile interior finish. It has two ingredients. It's the Viking Purified Linseed Oil and apothecary grade beeswax. It's appropriate for flooring, butcher block countertops, cutting boards, as well as furniture. So the only real key factors in terms of application is make sure that you wipe it in, apply relatively thin even coats, and let it soak in for a little bit, and then before end of day come back and buff off any excess. We just don't want to leave excess wax sort of sitting and being left to dry on the surface. We want that sort of finish in the wood. So after it's had a bit of time to soak in, just come back with a clean cloth, buff off that excess, and you'll feel after it is dried that beautiful smooth finish that we're looking for. Wipe on the natural wax in a thin, even coat, paying close attention to wood texture, corners, seams, all those nooks and crannies. After the first coat, if the wood grain still feels very dry, you can consider applying a second coat. Generally, one coat of the natural linseed oil wax is sufficient. I chose to wax the inside of the drawer as a first step to avoid my burnt umber stain bleeding into the wood grain. I think that there's more than one way to go about this, of course, but this was my strategy to give me a little bit more control during my sort of burnt umber staining step. I will still need to be careful during application, of course, but the wax fills in the wood grain, making it less absorbent and less likely to soak in the burnt umber stain when I go to apply it. And we're back. It's been about an hour and a half or so, and we're ready to buff off our excess linseed oil wax. I'm using a brand new clean cloth, cotton cloth. You just, or I often will just follow the wood grain buff into the wood surface and remove any excess wax that is sort of sitting on the surface. And as your cloth gets saturated, you can fold it over to a fresh side and do another pass if needed. Beautiful. At this point, we are going to, work our way on every side that we waxed for the drawer, as well as for the rest of the cabinet. And then we're going to leave that to dry for at least 24 hours or so before we proceed. It's been 24 hours and our Viking Natural Linseed Oil Wax is fully dry. It should feel fully dry to the touch, so it needs a little bit more time. Allow for that. But we're now ready to pigment our drawer front. I knew I wanted some pigmentation and contrast with the natural wax, and I mentioned I experimented with some burnt umber linseed oil stain ratios. So that's just the paint with more oil and adjusting the ratio based on personal preference. I did several coats to see how that would look, and what I found is that in this case, just using the paint full strength worked really well. And so what I did was wipe on the paint full strength, let it soak in for 10 minutes or so, and then come back and buff off the excess. This creates a really nice intensity of color, and from there I will let that dry fully, and I would recommend 48 hours or so to just make sure that your paint, even though it's a very thin coat you've buffed off the excess, is fully dry before we move on. So I applied a relatively thin, even coat, wiping it into the surface, especially into that sort of pinhole pattern of the white oak in this case. And I'm going to leave that for a few moments. In the meantime, I just want to talk about some shop safety. Whenever you're working on a project, even if it's just a small project like this, you might end up with oil or paint-soaked paper towels or rags. It's always good to have a bag with some water, nearby, so you can throw those in and avoid a fire hazard, or have a little metal container in the shop. And then at the end of the day, you can dispose of this safely. And again, linseed oil and linseed oil paint are not combustible. It's just in that drying process. We don't want to leave it, since it's a self-heating oil. We want to have good habits, good practices, and just dampen and dispose of your rags. It's been 10 or 15 minutes here, and we are ready to buff off the excess linseed oil paint. As you can see, there's a significant amount of paint left on the surface, and we're going to use a little bit of elbow grease and kind of buff that off, and you'll sort of see the dramatic difference as we do so. And as you see, we created a really beautiful color here with that burnt umber. We're going to leave to fully dry, as I said. 48 hours is realistic. And then we're going to top coat with the natural wax. The linseed oil stain does offer some nice sort of surface protection. It feels nice as you run your hand along it, but I like the continuity of sort of finishing the entire piece with the natural wax. It creates a really exceptional sort of smooth, moisture beading finish. So we're going to apply the natural wax on top of our stain, and that will be our last step before we install our hardware. I applied such a thin coat of Ottosson burnt umber to our drawer front that it actually felt dry to the touch in 24 hours, but I have waited 48 hours just to be on the safe side. We are going to apply a very thin coat of the natural linseed oil wax on top, and I'm using a clean cotton cloth, and I'm just going to sort of work my way from one side to the other. And part of why we need so little is because we've already applied the burnt umber linseed oil paint. It had a decent amount of purified linseed oil already. So the wood's not going to be super thirsty, and this is oak, so that will be sort of doubly true. Kind of see even a little bit more brilliance of that burnt umber comes out as we rub the wax in. You can let this soak in for a few minutes if you want. The key is just to get a little bit on there. Add up that nice moisture beading finish. Make sure that you are applying an even coat. I could probably even use this same cloth to kind of buff off the excess. We'll leave that to dry. It's been about 24 hours since we applied our natural Viking Linseed Oil Wax to our drawer front and on top of our burnt umber stain or rubbed in stain. It's fully dry to the touch, so we are able to proceed and add our hardware, and that is our final step, and this project is complete. In the years to come, I recommend cleaning with a gentle petrochemical-free liquid soap like Linseed Oil Soap. I would even say dilute it further, as we don't want to remove our finishes. We simply want to remove any dirt or spills that occur in the future. Now, from there, if any kind of significant damage happens to the natural wax, that's very easy. We just rub in more natural wax and do the same process we did with our initial application. And for the stain, we can do something similar. We can rub in some burnt umber linseed oil paint into those scratches, let that soak in for a few minutes, buff off any excess, let that dry, and then top coat with our natural wax. I hope you enjoyed this project and it gives you inspiration for your own furniture projects. Don't hesitate to reach out to us with questions and follow us on YouTube and Instagram.